If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. Now, what if I told you that most of the confusion, frustration, and emotional whiplash you experience in your interactions with women doesn't come from what they do, but from how you interpret their logic? You've been there. One moment things feel aligned, the next moment the rules seem to change. Words don't match actions. Signals feel layered, indirect, even contradictory. And you're left wondering, am I missing something obvious, or is this intentionally confusing? Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never tell you. Women's logic isn't broken. It operates on a different internal framework, one rooted in emotion, context, and shifting priorities rather than linear consistency. When you judge it using rigid masculine reasoning, it feels irrational. But once you understand the pattern, everything clicks. In this video, a woman breaks down the mysteries of women's logic from the inside out. No sugarcoating, no surface-level explanations. You'll learn why certain reactions repeat, why emotions override facts, and how misreading this logic quietly sabotages your confidence, boundaries, and decisions. Watch this video till the very end. The final insights will fundamentally change how you interpret behavior, respond calmly, and stop feeling confused or manipulated. If you've ever wanted clarity instead of chaos, this is where it begins. Number 1. Emotional reasoning over linear logic. When you hear the phrase emotional reasoning over linear logic, something in you might tense up. You've been trained, quietly, persistently, to believe that logic moves in straight lines, that truth is built like a ladder, rung by rung, premise to conclusion. But emotional reasoning doesn't walk in straight lines. It moves in currents. It circles. It senses before it concludes. And if you're honest with yourself, you already know this way of understanding the world isn't inferior. It's simply different. Wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." That line matters here, because emotional reasoning begins not with cold deduction, but with the state of the inner world. You don't feel first because you're illogical. You feel first because perception always arrives before explanation. The mistake is not emotional reasoning itself. The mistake is denying it, suppressing it, or pretending you don't use it too. You reason emotionally every single day. You just don't call it that. You sense tension before you can name why. You feel alignment or resistance long before you can justify it with words. Emotional logic is pattern recognition operating below conscious speech. It's the mind connecting dots faster than language can keep up. Linear logic says, "Show me step 1, then step 2. Emotional reasoning says, "Something here doesn't sit right," or "This feels true." That doesn't make it random. It makes it holistic. Epictetus reminded us, it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Emotional reasoning is the birthplace of judgment. Before the sentence forms in your head, the judgment has already happened. You can either learn to observe that process or be ruled by it unconsciously. This is where most people go wrong. They treat emotional reasoning as an enemy instead of a signal. They try to override it with force, as if thinking louder will make feeling disappear. It won't. Suppressed emotion doesn't vanish, it mutates. It leaks into decisions, reactions, and assumptions. Stoicism never asked you to kill emotion. It asked you to discipline your relationship with it. Seneca warned, "A man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." Emotional reasoning becomes destructive only when it runs unchecked, unquestioned, and unnamed. When you slow down and bring awareness to it, it transforms into insight. Here, where your work begins. Instead of asking, "Is this logical?" start asking, "What is this emotion trying to conclude for me?" Don't argue with it, listen to it. Emotional reasoning speaks in sensations, not syllogisms. Tightness, ease, pull, resistance. When you ignore those signals, you don't become rational, you become disconnected. Stoic discipline isn't about numbing yourself, it's about translating emotion into wisdom. Wrote, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. Emotional reasoning gives you the estimate. Your task is to examine it, refine it, and decide whether it deserves your assent. One powerful habit you can adopt is the pause of interpretation. When an emotion arises, don't label it good or bad, don't justify it. Simply say internally, this is an impression. That's straight from Epictetus. An impression is not truth, it's raw input. Sit with it. Let it exist without reaction. This alone weakens impulsive behavior. You're training yourself to separate feeling from command. Emotional reasoning loses its power to hijack you when you stop treating it like an order and start treating it like data. Another practice is emotional journaling without narrative. No stories, no explanations, just sensations and words that approximate them. Pressure, expansion, heat, stillness. You're not trying to make sense of anything yet. You're mapping your inner terrain. Over time, patterns emerge, not stories, patterns. This is emotional logic revealing itself cleanly, without distortion. Seneca believed daily reflection was essential because the unexamined inner life becomes chaotic. When you do this consistently, your emotional reasoning becomes sharper, not messier. You also need to train emotional restraint without suppression. That means allowing the emotion to be present while choosing not to act from it immediately. Count your breath, slow it deliberately, extend the exhale. This anchors you back into the body where emotional reasoning originates, but it keeps the nervous system from escalating. Stoicism calls this the ruling faculty. You feel, but you decide. That's the balance, not domination, not surrender, command. What changes when you adopt this mindset is profound. You stop demanding that emotional reasoning behave like linear logic. You stop forcing explanations prematurely. You allow understanding to ripen. Emotional logic often needs time, not argument. When you rush it, you distort it. When you sit with it, it clarifies itself. Advised, be patient with what you do not yet understand. That patience applies inwardly too. This isn't about choosing emotion over reason or reason over emotion. That's a false conflict. True clarity comes when emotional reasoning feeds into conscious judgment instead of replacing it. You learn to ask better questions of yourself. You learn to notice when an emotion is pointing to a boundary, a value, or a misalignment, without immediately reacting. This is where maturity lies. So take action now. Begin noticing before explaining. Pause before concluding. Treat emotions as messengers, not masters. Practice sitting with impressions without rushing to verdicts. Reflect daily, briefly, honestly. Train your breath. Train your attention. Over time, emotional reasoning stops feeling mysterious and starts feeling precise, quiet, reliable. You don't become wiser by silencing one part of your mind to elevate another. You become wiser by integrating them. As Epictetus said, first say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. That begins inside, always. Number 2, context matters more than consistency. When you begin to understand that context often outweighs consistency, something subtle but powerful shifts inside you. What once felt confusing starts to feel intelligible. What once felt irrational begins to reveal its own internal logic. You stop demanding straight lines where curves were always meant to exist. The Stoics warned you about this impulse long ago. Wrote, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. Your frustration was never about inconsistency. It was about your expectation that consistency should rule above all else. Women's logic does not reject reason, it prioritizes meaning. And meaning lives in the moment, in emotional weather, in unspoken signals, in subtle shifts of tone and energy. When you expect a rigid rule book, you miss the living reality unfolding in front of you. When you learn to read context instead of clinging to consistency, you become calmer, sharper, and far more grounded. You've been trained to believe that credibility comes from sameness, that strength means never changing position, that logic requires repetition. But emotional intelligence follows a different axis. A response can change not because values changed, but because the moment changed. The Stoics understood this well. Epictetus reminded you, circumstances do not make the man, they reveal him. Context reveals what consistency alone cannot. What matters is not whether a reaction matches a previous one, but whether it aligns with the emotional truth of the present moment. When you grasp this, you stop arguing with ghosts. You stop pulling up mental receipts. You stop saying, "But last time you said," because you realize last time no longer exists, only now exists, and now has its own rules. This is where most men exhaust themselves unnecessarily. You try to pin logic down like an insect under glass. You try to trap emotions in permanent statements. You demand alignment between yesterday and today, unaware that emotional landscapes are not architecture, they are weather. Seneca put it plainly, "A man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." Your suffering comes from resisting fluidity, from expecting emotional responses to behave like contracts instead of signals. When you release that demand, you don't become passive. You become precise. You listen better. You respond instead of react. You stop chasing certainty and start cultivating understanding. Here's the uncomfortable truth you must accept if you want peace. Context-driven logic is not weaker logic. It is layered logic. It accounts for tone, timing, safety, emotional momentum, and internal state. It weighs atmosphere more than precedent. That doesn't make it deceptive. It makes it adaptive. Nature itself operates this way. The Stoics modeled their philosophy on nature, not on rigid ideals. Urged you to observe constantly that all things take place by chain. Expecting emotional responses to remain static is not strength. It is denial. When you align yourself with change instead of fighting it, you gain leverage over your own emotions first. And that is where true power begins. Now here, where you turn this insight into discipline instead of just awareness. First exercise, practice contextual listening. For the next 7 days, stop mentally referencing past conversations while engaging in the present moment. When your mind reaches backward to compare, gently bring it back. Ask yourself silently, what is the emotional temperature right now? Not yesterday, not last week, right now. This trains you to stay anchored instead of argumentative. Second exercise, release the urge to correct emotional contradictions. When you feel the impulse to point out inconsistency, pause, take one slow breath. Remind yourself that emotions are responses, not policies. This single pause will save you hours of friction. Third exercise, develop internal consistency instead of external enforcement. Epictetus taught, first say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. Your consistency should live in your character, not in controlling others' expressions. Decide who you are going to be regardless of shifting context. Calm, observant, measured, self-contained. When your internal compass is steady, external fluctuations lose their power over you. Fourth exercise, journal without narrative. At the end of the day, write one paragraph describing emotional interactions using only neutral language. No blame, no interpretation, just observation. This trains your mind to see context without judgment, which is the foundation of Stoic clarity. What happens next is unexpected. When you stop demanding consistency, you become more trustworthy, not less. You stop escalating tension. You stop forcing logic where presence is required. And paradoxically, you start being taken more seriously. Why? Because you are no longer trying to win arguments. You are trying to understand reality. Seneca warned against the arrogance of rigid reasoning when he wrote, It is better to conquer our grief than to deceive it. The same applies here. It is better to master your response than to interrogate someone else's logic. This isn't about excusing chaos. It's about recognizing the difference between principles and expressions. Values can be stable while emotions fluctuate. Once you see this, confusion dissolves. You stop labeling behavior as illogical simply because it doesn't fit a linear pattern. You begin to see it as situational intelligence. And the moment you adopt this lens, your interactions become smoother, your mind becomes quieter, and your sense of control returns. Not because you control others, but because you finally control yourself. So take this with you. Let go of the courtroom mindset. Drop the need to cross-examine emotions. Stand where the Stoics stood, in reality, not in expectation. Context is not the enemy of logic. It is the environment in which logic breathes. And when you learn to read it without resentment, you stop being confused by women's logic altogether. You become fluent in it. Number 3, feelings define truth in the moment. You've probably sensed it before. That strange moment where logic bends, where yesterday's certainty dissolves, and where truth seems to shift with the emotional weather. This is where many people get stuck, frustrated, even resentful. But if you slow down and really observe what's happening, you'll notice something subtle and powerful at play. For many women, feelings don't merely color truth, they define it in the moment. Not as manipulation, not as deception, but as an internal compass that prioritizes emotional reality over static facts. And once you understand this, your confusion can turn into clarity. The Stoics warned you about this long ago, wrote that the mind colors events before reason ever speaks. He wasn't condemning emotion. He was reminding you that perception is rarely neutral. Feelings rise first, judgments follow, and reason often arrives late, trying to justify what has already been decided internally. When you expect truth to remain fixed while emotions fluctuate, you set yourself up for frustration. But when you accept that emotional truth is fluid, moment-based, and deeply felt, you stop fighting reality and start navigating it with calm intelligence. Here's the shift you need to make. Stop treating feelings as arguments that need to be defeated. Feelings are not debating points, they are signals. In the moment they arise, they feel absolute, undeniable, and real. A woman isn't changing her story because she wants to confuse you. She's responding to her current internal state. What feels true now overrides what felt true then. From the Stoic lens, this is simply the dominance of impressions over reason. Epictetus warned that people are disturbed not by events, but by the judgments they form about them. When emotions surge, judgments harden. Truth becomes whatever aligns with the emotional state of that instant. This is where you either lose your balance or gain immense leverage. If you argue facts while emotions are elevated, you appear disconnected, cold, invalidating, not because facts are wrong, but because timing is everything. Stoicism teaches restraint for this very reason. The wise person waits. He doesn't rush to correct impressions. He allows emotional waves to pass before introducing reason. You don't meet fire with fuel, you meet it with stillness. What most men get wrong is assuming consistency is the highest form of integrity. Stoicism never demanded emotional consistency from others. It demanded emotional mastery from you. Seneca wrote that a wise person adapts himself to circumstances, not the other way around. When you expect emotional logic to behave like mathematical logic, you're demanding the impossible. Emotional truth is situational. It responds to tone, presence, safety, tension, and meaning. When those variables shift, so does what feels true. This doesn't mean you abandon your standards or silence your reason. It means you learn when to speak and how to listen. You stop reacting to the surface and begin observing the pattern. Feelings define truth in the moment because the moment feels eternal when emotions are strong. Your job is not to correct the feeling, but to remain grounded while it expresses itself. Calm becomes your anchor. Silence becomes your strength. Presence becomes your language. There's a Stoic exercise that fits perfectly here. When you feel the urge to explain, defend, or correct, pause. Take a breath and say internally, "This is an impression, not a verdict." That single sentence restores your power. You're no longer pulled into emotional turbulence. You become the stable reference point. Over time, that stability becomes more persuasive than any argument you could make. Another practice: detach urgency from truth. Just because something feels urgent doesn't mean it's final. The Stoics trained themselves to delay assent, to avoid immediately agreeing with the first emotional impression. You can do the same. When emotions dominate the moment, let them have the stage without resistance. Truth will recalibrate once emotional intensity settles. It always does. This understanding also frees you from taking emotional shifts personally. When truth changes with feeling, it's not an attack on you. It's an internal happening in real time. The mistake is thinking every emotional conclusion is a permanent judgment. Stoicism teaches impermanence. Everything flows. Emotions rise and fall. Certainties dissolve and reform. The man who understands this doesn't chase consistency. He embodies steadiness. Your new habit is simple but demanding. Replace the need to be right with the discipline to be calm. Replace urgency with patience. Replace explanation with presence. When you do this, something interesting happens. Emotional truth begins to soften around you, not because you forced it, but because calm invites clarity. When feelings no longer need to defend themselves, reason quietly returns. Remember what reminded himself daily. You don't control the minds of others, only your own responses. When feelings define truth in the moment, your role isn't to resist that truth, but to outlast it with composure. That is power. That is Stoic intelligence in motion. So take this with you. Observe more, react less. Let emotions speak without interruption. Train yourself to wait before responding. Write this down if you must. I do not argue with emotions. I remain steady until clarity returns. Practice this daily. This is not passivity, it's mastery. And once you internalize it, confusion fades, resentment dissolves, and you move through these dynamics with quiet confidence and unshakable control. Number 4, intuition overrides explanation. You've probably noticed that some truths don't arrive through neat explanations. They arrive whole, immediate, felt before they're understood. Intuition works like that. It doesn't ask permission from logic, and it doesn't wait for language to catch up. It moves first. And when you try to interrogate it, it often goes silent. This is where frustration begins, especially if you've trained yourself to value explanations above all else. But intuition isn't broken logic. It's a different instrument entirely. One that reads patterns faster than words can form. When you insist on explanations before you allow intuition any legitimacy, you end up deaf to a large portion of human understanding. The Stoics were deeply aware of this, even if they didn't use the modern word intuition. Reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. What he was pointing to wasn't just rational thought, but inner perception, a quiet knowing that precedes argument. You feel something align or resist before you can justify it. That feeling is information, not always perfect, not always complete, but information nonetheless. When intuition overrides explanation, it's not rebelling against reason. It's simply refusing to be cross-examined before it speaks. You're often taught to distrust this, to demand proof, to insist that everything makes sense on paper before it's allowed to be real. But human psychology doesn't operate like a spreadsheet. Your nervous system, your emotional memory, your unconscious pattern recognition, all of it is constantly processing data beneath your awareness. Intuition is the summary report, condensed, wordless, fast. When you ask, "Why do I feel this way?" and no clean answer appears, that doesn't mean the feeling is irrational. It means the explanation hasn't caught up yet. Epictetus warned, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." That line alone dismantles the obsession with explanation. Some things are meant to be lived, not defended. Intuition works the same way. It doesn't argue its case. It doesn't persuade, it simply points. And if you force it to justify itself prematurely, you often weaken your connection to it. You train yourself to ignore inner signals unless they come with a thesis statement attached. Over time, that habit dulls perception. This is where many people get stuck. You try to reason your way through every internal signal, turning your inner world into a courtroom. Every feeling must testify. Every instinct must produce evidence. And when it can't, you dismiss it. But Stoicism was never about suppressing inner awareness. It was about disciplining your response to it. Feeling is data. Judgment is optional. Action is chosen. Intuition offers the data. Wisdom lies in how you relate to it. If you want to work with intuition instead of fighting it, you need to slow your demand for explanations. Not eliminate reason, temper it. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." That suffering often comes from overthinking signals that were meant to be simple. A sense of unease, a pull towards something, a quiet resistance. These aren't commands, they're indicators. When intuition overrides explanation, it's asking you to pause, not panic, to observe, not react. Here, where you adopt a new habit. When a strong intuitive feeling arises and you can't explain it, resist the urge to label it right away. Instead of asking why, ask, what is this asking of my attention? That subtle shift keeps you curious rather than combative. You're no longer interrogating your inner world, you're listening to it. Curiosity keeps intuition alive. Hostility shuts it down. Another practice is to separate intuition from impulse. They're not the same. Intuition is calm. Even when it's urgent, it's quiet. Impulse is loud, reactive, impatient. The Stoics emphasize tranquility as a marker of alignment. If a feeling is frantic, it likely isn't intuition, it's agitation. So when explanation feels absent, check the tone. Calm signals depth. Noise signals confusion. This alone will refine your internal compass. You're also invited to practice delay, not suppression delay. Intuition doesn't demand immediate action. It asks for acknowledgement. When you feel it override explanation, say internally, "I see you." Then give it space. Let time reveal context. Often, clarity emerges later, not because you forced it, but because you allowed the mind to organize what the intuition already knew. This trains trust without recklessness. Advised, be like the cliff against which the waves continually break, but it stands firm and tames the fury of the water around it. Intuition is one of those waves. You don't need to be swept away by it, nor do you need to deny its existence. You stand firm. You let it wash over your awareness. You remain steady. Over time, you'll notice that intuition becomes clearer the less you fight it. A practical exercise you can adopt daily is silent nodding. When an intuitive signal appears, don't explain it, don't act on it, don't analyze it, just note it. Mentally record, there is a sense of resistance, or there is a sense of pull. No story, no justification. This builds intimacy with your inner signals without distortion. You're training perception, not interpretation. Another exercise is retrospective understanding. At the end of your day, reflect quietly. Ask yourself where intuition showed up without explanation. Not to judge whether it was right or wrong, but to notice its presence. This reflection strengthens pattern recognition. Over time, explanations often reveal themselves backward. What once felt mysterious begins to make sense, not because you demanded it, but because you matured into it. Ultimately, intuition overriding explanation isn't a flaw in thinking. It's a reminder that not all intelligence speaks in sentences. Some wisdom arrives as a feeling before it ever becomes a thought. Stoicism doesn't ask you to silence that voice. It asks you to govern your response to it, to neither worship it blindly nor dismiss it arrogantly. So the next time explanation fails you, don't assume you've lost clarity. You may be closer to it than you think. Slow down, breathe, listen. Let intuition speak in its own language. Then when reason finally arrives, as it often does, let it serve understanding, not dominate it. This is how you move through the world with calm awareness, inner strength, and a deeper trust in yourself. Number 5, subtext speaks louder than words. When you start to understand that subtext often speaks louder than words, something subtle but powerful shifts inside you. You stop clinging to the literal sentence that was spoken and begin listening to the emotional frequency underneath it. This is where women's logic often lives, not in the surface language, but in tone, timing, emphasis, silence, rhythm, and what is deliberately left unsaid. Words are only the outer garment. Meaning is the body beneath it. And if you train yourself to hear only the garment, you will miss the body entirely. You will argue with sentences while the real message walks past you untouched. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology tried to explain it. Wrote, "People do not disturb us, our judgments about them do." What he was pointing to is this: what unsettles you is rarely the words themselves, but the interpretation you attach to them. Subtext is interpretation made visible. It is the emotional context wrapped around language. When a woman speaks, she is often communicating not just information, but orientation. How she feels, where she stands, what she expects next, and how safe or unsafe she feels in the moment. If you listen only for facts, you will miss orientation. And when you miss orientation, confusion follows. Here is the uncomfortable truth you need to accept if you want clarity. Subtext is not manipulation by default. It is compression. It is efficient communication in an emotional language. Words are blunt instruments for emotional nuance, so subtext does the fine carving. This is why two identical sentences can carry completely different meanings depending on how they are delivered. And this is also why arguing about what was said rarely resolves anything. You are debating the shell while the signal lives elsewhere. The mistake you must stop making is treating communication as a courtroom transcript. That approach feels logical, controlled, even righteous, but it is blind to emotional reality. Epictetus warned, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." In this context, that means letting go of the need to be technically correct. You may be right about the words and still completely wrong about the meaning. Stoic wisdom is not about suppressing perception. It is about refining it. And perceiving subtext is refinement. When you slow down and truly listen, you begin to notice patterns. Pauses matter. Repetition matters. What is emphasized matters. What is avoided matters. The emotional weight of a sentence often matters more than its grammatical structure. Subtext is where priorities reveal themselves. It shows you what matters without announcing it. If you remain calm and observant instead of reactive and defensive, this layer becomes visible to you. Seneca said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Many misunderstandings around women's logic come from imagined intentions attached to misunderstood subtext. You assume hostility where there is uncertainty. You assume criticism where there is a bid for reassurance. You assume contradiction where there is emotional ambivalence. Subtext is not always clean or consistent because emotions are not clean or consistent. Expecting perfectly linear expression from an emotional being, yourself included, is unrealistic. This is where discipline comes in. The Stoic path teaches you to master your internal reactions first. When you hear words that confuse or irritate you, your task is not to correct them immediately. Your task is to stabilize yourself. Calm is clarity. Without calm, you cannot decode subtext. You can only project onto it. And projection is the enemy of understanding. Instead of responding quickly, practice holding space internally. Let the sentence land. Let the emotional tone register. Ask yourself what feeling might be driving the words, rather than what argument they are trying to win. This is not submission. This is strategic patience. Reminded himself daily to meet confusion with composure. You must do the same. To train this skill, adopt simple internal exercises. When you hear something puzzling, silently label the possible emotion beneath it. Uncertainty, frustration, hope, fear, anticipation, without acting on it. This builds emotional literacy without turning interaction into analysis paralysis. Another exercise is restraint. Delay your response just long enough to breathe and soften your face. Calm presence often invites clarity without demanding it. You can also practice translation internally. Take the words you hear and ask yourself, if this were an emotional message rather than a factual one, what might it be pointing to? Do not answer aloud. This is for your own orientation. Over time, this habit sharpens intuition without making you reactive or needy. Epictetus emphasized control over impressions. Subtext is an impression. You are not required to obey it, only to see it clearly. What makes this difficult is ego. Ego wants certainty. Ego wants to pin meaning down and win. But understanding women's logic requires humility. The humility to accept that emotional communication does not always arrive in bullet points. It arrives in atmosphere. An atmosphere cannot be argued with, only understood or ignored. The paradox is this: the less you demand explicitness, the more explicit communication often becomes. When a woman feels that you can perceive without interrogation, she feels safer to speak plainly. Subtext decreases when safety increases. This is not manipulation. It is emotional economics. Pressure creates compression. Calm creates expansion. You must also accept that sometimes subtext is unresolved emotion being processed in real time. Not every message is final. Not every statement is a position. Stoicism teaches you not to chase certainty where none exists yet. Wait, as the Stoics would advise. Observe. Let patterns reveal themselves over time rather than forcing clarity prematurely. Your task is not to decode every nuance perfectly. Your task is to become the kind of man whose presence reduces confusion rather than amplifies it. Calm attention, emotional steadiness, the refusal to overreact. These are not passive traits. They are disciplined ones. If you commit to this path, you will notice something unexpected. Communication becomes lighter, less tense, less adversarial. You stop fighting words and start understanding meaning. And when meaning is understood, words no longer feel like traps. They feel like signals. So train yourself daily. Listen beyond language. Master your reactions. Let silence teach you. As wrote, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. What once felt confusing becomes your training ground. And in that training, women's logic stops feeling mysterious, not because it has changed, but because you finally have. Number 6. Memory is emotional, not chronological. Memory is not a filing cabinet. It is not a calendar with neat dates and orderly labels. It breathes, it bends. It remembers how something felt far more vividly than when it happened. And if you want to understand women's logic at a deeper level, without frustration, without resentment, you have to release the idea that memory operates like a timeline. It doesn't. It operates like a weather system. Pressure, temperature, intensity. You don't remember the hour the storm began. You remember how hard it hit. You've probably noticed that certain moments resurface again and again, even when you're convinced they should be over by now. That's because emotional memory does not decay by time alone. It fades only when the emotional charge dissolves. Until then, it remains active, present, almost alive. This isn't irrational, it's human. And the Stoics understood this long before modern psychology tried to measure it, wrote that the mind colors everything it touches. Memory is one of those things. What mattered emotionally becomes. What felt threatening, disappointing, or meaningful leaves a deeper imprint than neutral events ever could. Here, where your habits come in. When you expect memory to be chronological, you argue with time. You say things like "that was long ago" or "why are we still here?" But emotional memory doesn't respond to logic like that. It responds to regulation. It responds to consistency. It responds when the emotional environment changes, not when the clock keeps ticking. Epictetus reminded his students that it's not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Emotional memory is simply judgment stored in the body. It's not trying to punish you. It's trying to protect something. If you want to navigate this with strength instead of resistance, you have to train yourself to listen without rushing to correct. That doesn't mean agreeing. It means staying present long enough for the emotional charge to settle. When you remain calm, when you don't escalate, when you don't dismiss, you're doing something powerful. You're teaching the nervous system that the present moment is safer than the remembered one. This is how emotional memory slowly loosens its grip, not through force, through steadiness. And this is where Stoicism becomes practical instead of philosophical. Stoicism isn't about suppressing emotion. It's about mastering your response to it. Seneca warned that unchecked emotion distorts perception, but he never argued for emotional blindness. He argued for clarity, for composure, for refusing to be dragged into reaction. When you anchor yourself in calm, you stop feeding the emotional loop. You stop becoming part of the storm. You need to adopt a new habit here. Stop trying to win memory. You cannot out-argue an emotional imprint. What you can do is outgrow it. Every time you choose patience over irritation, presence over defensiveness, groundedness over urgency, you weaken the emotional residue that keeps resurfacing. This isn't passive. It's disciplined. It requires restraint. And restraint is power. Notice how different this is from trying to control outcomes. You're not managing someone else's memory. You're managing your own state. That's the only place Stoicism ever asks you to operate. Control what is yours. Release what is. Emotional memory softens when it no longer detects threat. Your calm becomes corrective without a single word spoken. Here's a simple practice you can start using immediately. When something from the past resurfaces, don't track when it happened. Track what emotion is present right now. Name it internally. Don't analyze it, just recognize it. Then slow your breathing and lengthen your exhale. This signals safety. You're not solving anything in that moment. You're stabilizing the field. Do this consistently and you'll notice something subtle but profound. The emotional charge loses intensity faster each time. Another practice, rehearse non-reactivity. Before conversations, remind yourself that memory may arrive emotionally, not logically. Prepare to stay grounded anyway. This isn't about submission. It's about leadership. Emotional leadership is rare because most people outsource it to impulse. You're choosing otherwise. And here's the deeper truth most people miss. Emotional memory isn't a flaw in women's logic. It's a different operating system. One tuned to patterns, emotional continuity, and meaning rather than timestamps. When you stop treating it like a malfunction, you stop fighting shadows. You begin responding to what's actually there. This shift will change how you speak, how you listen, how you hold your posture in difficult moments. You'll become slower to react and faster to stabilize. You'll stop feeling ambushed by the past because you'll understand that the past is what's showing up. The emotion is. And emotion can be regulated. Also wrote, the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. Applied here, the lesson is simple. Don't mirror emotional chaos with emotional chaos. Be the still point. Be the calm surface. Over time, emotional memory recalibrates itself around consistency, around predictability, around safety. Take this seriously. Practice it daily. Not perfectly, consistently. Let go of the need to be immediately understood. Focus instead on being steady. Emotional memory respects strength that doesn't shout. It yields to calm that doesn't demand. And when you embody that, you're no longer confused by women's logic. You're fluent in it. Number 7. Validation before solutions. If you wish to improve, be content to appear foolish or stupid in the eyes of others. Sit with that line for a moment because it opens the door to what most people miss when it comes to understanding women's logic. You've been trained, conditioned, even rewarded for solving problems. You hear tension and your mind reaches for tools. You hear confusion and your instincts want clarity. But here is the quiet truth that keeps slipping past you. Logic does not always begin with solutions. Very often it begins with validation, not approval, not agreement, recognition, acknowledgement, presence. When a woman speaks, she is not always handing you a puzzle to crack. She is often revealing an internal state that wants to be seen before it wants to be fixed. And if you rush past that step, no matter how intelligent or correct your solution is, it lands flat. Worse, it creates distance. You feel misunderstood. She feels unheard. And both of you walk away frustrated, convinced the other is being irrational. That's not women's logic failing. That's your timing being off. The Stoics understood something profound about human nature long before modern psychology put labels on it. Reminded himself daily that people act from what seems right to them in the moment. Seneca warned that emotion unexamined becomes emotion. Validation is not indulgence. It is examination. It is the act of saying, without panic or resistance, I see what is happening inside you. Only after that can reason enter the room without being rejected. Here, where you're being invited to grow, validation before solutions requires restraint. And restraint is a Stoic virtue. It asks you to suspend your ego, to pause the urge to prove competence, to resist the reflex of control. You don't need to dominate the moment with answers. You need to stabilize it with understanding. When you do this, something subtle shifts. The emotional charge softens. Defensiveness loosens its grip. Logic is no longer fighting emotion. It's walking beside it. You might feel uncomfortable at first. That's expected. The Stoics never promised comfort. They promised mastery. Epictetus was clear. You don't control events, you control your judgments. Validation is a judgment choice. You are choosing to judge connection as more important than being right. You are choosing long-term harmony over short-term cleverness. And paradoxically, that choice makes your eventual solutions far more effective. Understand this deeply. Validation does not mean you abandon reason. It means you sequence it correctly. Emotion first, structure second. Feeling acknowledged creates psychological safety. And safety is the gateway through which logic is welcomed, not resisted. When you skip validation, your solution feels like dismissal. When you lead with validation, your solution feels like support. This is where women's logic becomes clearer if you stop fighting it and start listening beneath the words. Logic, in this context, is relational. It prioritizes connection before correction. Not because solutions don't matter, but because solutions without emotional grounding feel hollow. You may think you're helping. She may experience it as distance. The difference is not intention, it's awareness. The Stoics practice something you can apply immediately: deliberate pause. Wrote about slowing the mind before reacting. That pause is where validation lives. It's where you breathe, listen, and allow the moment to unfold without hijacking it with your intellect. This pause trains patience. And patience, Seneca reminds us, is not passive. It is power under control. If you want to adopt this habit, start with a simple internal rule. Do not solve what has not yet been seen. When emotion is present, your first task is acknowledgement, not architecture. Let your presence do the heavy lifting. Let your calm signal safety. Solutions offered too early feel like walls. Solutions offered after validation feel like bridges. There is also something quietly transformative that happens inside you when you practice this. You begin to detach from the need to perform. You stop equating worth with usefulness. You realize that being grounded, attentive, and emotionally disciplined is far more attractive than being perpetually clever. This is Stoic masculinity in action. Quiet, observant, unrushed. Now let's make this practical without turning it mechanical. One exercise is daily reflection, straight from playbook. At the end of your day, ask yourself, where did I rush to fix instead of first understanding? Don't judge yourself. Observe. Awareness precedes change. Another exercise is intentional silence. When emotion arises, count 3 breaths before responding. This interrupts the reflex to solve and gives space for validation to emerge naturally. You can also practice reframing internally. Instead of hearing a problem, hear an experience being expressed. That shift alone recalibrates your response. You stop preparing answers and start offering presence. Over time, this becomes instinctual. Effort turns into character. Remember, Stoicism is not about suppressing emotion. It's about ordering it wisely. Validation before solutions is not a trick. It's alignment with human nature. It respects the fact that logic is most powerful when it arrives after the storm has settled, not while it's still raging. So take this seriously. Practice it deliberately. Let go of the urge to fix everything immediately. Master the pause. Lead with understanding, and watch how clarity, trust, and influence begin to flow naturally without force. Because in the end, the most logical thing you can do is understand first. Number 8. Changeability without guilt. Changeability without guilt is one of those ideas that unsettles people because it threatens their hunger for certainty. You've been taught to expect consistency, predictability, a clean line from yesterday to today to tomorrow. Yet here's the uncomfortable truth. Inner landscapes shift, priorities rearrange themselves, emotions evolve, and meaning doesn't stay frozen. What often gets labeled as confusing is really an instinctive permission to adapt without dragging shame behind it. You feel something today, something different tomorrow, and instead of apologizing for being alive and responsive, you move with it. That movement isn't chaos. It's responsiveness. It's alignment with the moment you're actually in, not the one you promised to inhabit weeks ago. From a Stoic perspective, this isn't weakness at all. One ancient thinker warned against becoming rigid, saying the mind should be like a living thing, able to bend without breaking. Another wrote that you must not demand life to happen as you wish, but wish for it to happen as it does. Changeability without guilt flows from that exact posture. You stop clinging to outdated internal contracts. You stop punishing yourself for no longer being who you were when you made a decision from a different state of mind. Instead, you adjust, calmly, quietly, without the drama of self-betrayal. What confuses you is that this change doesn't always come with an announcement. There isn't a committee meeting inside the mind. One day something feels right, then it doesn't. That shift doesn't require justification, courtroom arguments, or moral confession. The Stoics understood that impressions arise on their own. What matters is how you respond to them. Feelings, preferences, desires, these are impressions. They move like weather. Guilt enters only when you mistakenly believe you must remain loyal to every past emotional state as if it were a binding oath. But emotions were never meant to be prisons. They're signals, temporary, informative, and replaceable. You've probably been conditioned to think that changing your mind equals deception or manipulation. That belief keeps you trapped. The Stoic response is simple and brutal in its clarity. You are responsible for your judgments, not for freezing yourself in time. If new information arrives internally, if your sense of rightness changes, the disciplined response is to update your judgment. Not to cling, not to self-flagellate, not to over-explain, just adjust. The guilt people expect to see is absent because guilt would imply wrongdoing. Adaptation is not wrongdoing, it's wisdom in motion. This is where your discomfort begins. You want emotional continuity because it feels safe. You want others to behave like contracts instead of organisms, but Stoicism dismantles that illusion. One philosopher wrote that everything is in flux, like a river you cannot step into twice. If that's true, then demanding emotional consistency is demanding the impossible. Changeability without guilt is simply accepting reality instead of fighting it. It's not careless. It's not cruel. It's realistic. The real power here is internal. When you release guilt around change, you stop negotiating against yourself. You no longer waste energy defending outdated feelings. You become harder to manipulate because guilt is one of the easiest levers to pull. Stoics warned constantly about external control over the inner world. If someone can make you feel ashamed for evolving, they can steer your behavior. But when you accept change as natural, guilt loses its grip. You become internally sovereign. This doesn't mean impulsiveness. Stoicism never praises reckless reaction, it praises awareness. The difference matters. Changeability without guilt isn't emotional chaos, it's selective alignment. You notice what arises, examine it, and decide whether to move with it. And when you do, you move cleanly. No residue, no self-attack. One Stoic line puts it plainly: if it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. Notice what's missing there. No instruction to feel guilty for past choices that no longer fit. Here, where you can turn this into a practice instead of a concept. First exercise, daily mental updates. At the end of the day, ask yourself one quiet question: what feels different now than it did this morning? Don't judge the answer, just notice it. This trains you to observe change without attaching moral weight to it. Second exercise, remove apology from your inner dialogue. When you notice a shift, resist the urge to justify it internally. Replace explanation with acknowledgement. This has changed, nothing more. Third exercise, practice non-attachment to yesterday's conclusions. Write down one belief or preference you held recently, then write, "This was true for me then." That sentence dissolves guilt while preserving honesty. Another Stoic reminder fits perfectly here. You don't control what appears in your mind, only what you consent to. Changeability without guilt is simply refusing to consent to shame for being responsive to life. You're not required to suffer to prove sincerity. You're not required to remain uncomfortable to appear consistent. You're required only to act with integrity in the present moment. When you understand this, something shifts in you too. You stop demanding explanations from yourself. You stop expecting emotional loyalty as proof of character. You become steadier, not shakier, because flexibility, paradoxically, creates resilience. Rigid things snap, living things adapt. So take this with you. Let change happen without self-punishment. Let preferences evolve without apology. Let inner movement be what it is, information, not indictment. The Stoics didn't seek control over life, they sought harmony with it. And harmony requires motion. Stay attentive. Stay composed. Update your inner map as often as reality demands. Then move forward without guilt, without drama, and without asking permission to be aligned with who you are now. Number 9, testing boundaries unconsciously. Testing boundaries unconsciously is rarely a deliberate act, and that's the part most people miss. It isn't a plotted scheme or a cold calculation. It's a quiet, almost invisible impulse that surfaces when safety meets curiosity, when emotion brushes against structure, when uncertainty looks for something solid to press against. And if you're not aware of this dynamic, you end up reacting instead of leading yourself. You start taking things personally that were never meant to be personal. The Stoics warned about this long ago. Epictetus said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." Boundary testing becomes disruptive only when you misjudge what it is and respond from ego instead of clarity. At its core, unconscious boundary testing is a form of emotional calibration. It's a way the mind checks the shape, strength, and consistency of what's in front of it, not through logic but through feeling. Words may say one thing, but behavior quietly asks another question. Are you stable here? Are you consistent? Are you grounded enough to remain yourself when pressure appears? You don't need to like this process, but understanding it changes everything. When you stop seeing boundary testing as disrespect and start seeing it as information, you regain control of your internal state. You stop tightening. You stop explaining. You stop defending. And in that stillness, your presence speaks louder than any argument ever could. This is where most people slip. They respond too fast. They rush to clarify, justify, or reassert themselves with force. But force is fragile. The Stoic path has always favored firmness without friction. Reminded himself, the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. In this context, that means not mirroring emotional volatility with emotional volatility. Unconscious boundary testing feeds on reaction. It grows louder when it senses instability. But when it meets calm consistency, it resolves on its own. Not because it was defeated, but because it found nothing chaotic to push against. You need to understand this deeply. Boundaries are not speeches. They are states of being. When you feel compelled to constantly explain your limits, it's often because you're not fully rooted in them yet. A boundary that lives only in words will always be tested again. A boundary that lives in posture, tone, timing, and emotional regulation rarely needs repetition. Seneca put it simply, "He who is brave is free." Bravery here doesn't mean confrontation. It means the courage to remain composed when someone unconsciously presses against your edge. What makes this dynamic confusing is that the testing often feels subtle. It may appear as a slight shift in tone, a small request that bends your routine, a moment that invites you to abandon your standards just this once. None of it screams danger. That's why awareness matters. Stoicism trains you to pause before you react, to observe the internal ripple before it becomes an external wave. When you notice that familiar urge to explain yourself, to overgive, to overcorrect, that's your signal. Not to clamp down harder, but to slow down, to breathe, to choose alignment over approval. Here, where action begins. Not outward action, but inner discipline. Start with this exercise. Whenever you feel pressure to adjust yourself for comfort or harmony, don't respond immediately. Count 10 slow breaths. Let the impulse pass through you without obeying it. Ask yourself silently, is this aligned with my values, or am I trying to manage a feeling? This single pause rewires your behavior over time. It trains your nervous system to stay steady when tested, even unconsciously. Another practice is mental rehearsal. Each morning, visualize yourself remaining calm when boundaries are lightly pressed, not resisting, not explaining, just being. The Stoics called this the practice of preparing the mind before the moment arrives. You are not predicting conflict. You are strengthening composure. When the moment comes, you won't need to perform strength. You'll already be standing in it. You should also train yourself to speak less, not more. Silence, when grounded, is not weakness. It's clarity. When you don't rush to fill space, you allow the other person's uncertainty to surface and resolve on its own. Epictetus advised, "Nature has given men one tongue but two ears, that we may hear from others twice as much as we speak." Listening without surrendering yourself is one of the strongest boundaries you can embody. The most important habit to adopt is consistency. Boundaries collapse not because they are challenged, but because they are enforced selectively. When you hold the line one day and abandon it the next, confusion grows, not just externally, but within you. Consistency creates predictability, and predictability dissolves unconscious testing. The mind stops probing when it understands the terrain. Remember this, you are not here to control behavior. You are here to govern yourself. Stoicism never promised comfort, it promised freedom through self-mastery. When you stop personalizing unconscious boundary testing, you stop leaking energy into unnecessary battles. You remain centered, calm, unmoved, and paradoxically, that's when respect emerges without demand. So take this forward with intention. Practice the pause, train your silence, strengthen your consistency. Let your boundaries exist as quiet facts, not emotional negotiations. As wrote, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. Adjust the estimate and the pressure dissolves. This is not about winning moments. It's about becoming unshakable in all of them. Number 10, logic serves connection, not accuracy. Most people are taught quietly, almost unconsciously, that logic exists to discover truth, that it is a tool for accuracy, precision, and clean conclusions. But when you look closer, when you stop arguing and start observing, you begin to notice something subtler. For many women, logic is not primarily a weapon to win debates or a ruler to measure who is right. Logic serves connection. It serves emotional alignment. It serves harmony. And when you finally understand this, confusion dissolves into clarity. You've probably felt this tension before. You approach a conversation believing that facts will settle it, that the correct explanation will calm the situation. Instead, accuracy seems to inflame it. Your reasoning lands, but it doesn't land well. That's not because logic has failed. It's because you're using it for a different purpose than the one being asked of you. Logic in this frame is not about constructing an airtight argument. It's about preserving relational balance. When accuracy threatens that balance, accuracy becomes irrelevant. This is where many people lose their footing. You assume inconsistency means irrationality. You hear contradictions and think, this doesn't make sense. But sense is contextual. Logic here is adaptive, not absolute. It bends to protect emotional truth, even if it sacrifices factual precision. And emotional truth in these moments matters more than chronological detail or verbal consistency. You may feel tempted to correct, to clarify, to refine. But correction can feel like rejection. Clarification can feel like dismissal. Precision can feel cold. The Stoics understood something most people forget. As Epictetus said, it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Notice what that implies. Reality is filtered through perception, and perception is guided by emotion long before reason steps in. When logic is used to maintain connection, it becomes a tool for regulating perception, not dissecting reality. It's less about what happened and more about how it felt. Less about winning and more about staying bonded. This doesn't mean truth has no value. It means timing does. It means hierarchy matters. Accuracy without attunement feels hostile. You may believe you're being fair, rational, even generous. But if the emotional signal underneath the conversation feels threatened, logic becomes defensive instead of collaborative. You're speaking a different language than the moment requires. Wrote, be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. This is not passive advice. It's a discipline. Tolerance here means understanding that not all reasoning aims at the same destination. Some reasoning aims at peace, some at reassurance, some at emotional safety. When you stop demanding that every conversation serve your standard of logic, you gain leverage, not over others, but over yourself. Think about how often you rush to resolve instead of regulate, to explain instead of understand, to correct instead of connect. You're not wrong for valuing clarity, but clarity without warmth doesn't soothe, it sharpens. The habit to build here is restraint. The habit of letting logic pause so presence can lead. You don't abandon reason, you delay it. There is a quiet strength in this. Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free." Emotional bravery is staying steady when your instincts want to dominate the narrative. It's allowing emotional coherence to form before intellectual coherence. When you do this, conversations soften, resistance lowers, and only then does accuracy have a place to stand. You might notice something else when you practice this shift. The so-called contradictions start resolving themselves. When emotional safety is restored, logic becomes more linear, more consistent, more receptive. The paradox is that letting go of accuracy at the start often leads to greater accuracy at the end. Not because you forced it, but because you earned the space for it. This requires a new habit of listening, not listening for gaps, not listening for flaws, listening for signals, listening for what needs to be affirmed before it can be examined. When someone feels heard, they become more rational, not less. That's not psychology jargon, that's human nature. Here's a simple exercise you can practice immediately. In your next emotionally charged conversation, say less than you want to. When you feel the urge to explain, pause, ask yourself silently, what emotion is being protected right now, not out loud, internally. Let that guide your response. You're training perception, not speech. Another exercise, separate resolution from reassurance. Tell yourself, I don't need to solve this moment, I need to stabilize it. This reframes your role. You move from debater to anchor, from explainer to presence. Over time, this changes how people respond to you. They relax, they open, they listen. Epictetus also warned, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Sometimes wisdom looks like silence. Sometimes strength looks like restraint. You may feel misunderstood in the moment, but you gain influence in the long arc. Logic that serves connection is not weak logic. It is strategic logic. It understands that humans are not equations. They are systems, emotional systems. When you respect the system, the parts align. When you attack the parts, the system defends itself. So the habit you adopt now is simple but not easy. You stop asking, is this accurate, first. You ask, is this connective? Accuracy can come later. Repair can come later. Truth survives patience. Connection doesn't survive pressure. And when you practice this long enough, something unexpected happens. You become calmer, less reactive, less eager to prove, more grounded. You stop chasing being right and start embodying steadiness. That steadiness becomes magnetic. As reminded himself, the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injustice. In modern terms, the best response to emotional chaos is composure. Logic in service of connection is composure applied intelligently. Take this seriously. Practice it deliberately. Notice the shift, not in others first, but in you. When you master this, conversations stop feeling like battles and start feeling like flows. And that's when understanding deepens, not because you argued better, but because you listened wiser. As we come to the end of this conversation, here's the quiet truth most people miss. Women's logic isn't chaotic, irrational, or mysterious by accident. It's contextual, emotional, and deeply responsive to presence. When you stop fighting it, judging it, or trying to win against it, something powerful happens. You start seeing patterns instead of contradictions, meaning instead of confusion, calm instead of frustration. The mistake most men make is trying to decode women with ego, impatience, or fear. But clarity doesn't come from force. It comes from composure, from listening without reacting, from standing grounded while emotions move around you. That's not weakness, it's mastery. If this video shifted even one assumption you've been carrying, don't let it end here. Rewatch it. Sit with it. Let the ideas settle instead of rushing to conclusions. Understanding women isn't about having all the answers. It's about having the self-control to stay centered when others are. If you found value in this, like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who's still confused by what they don't yet understand. And remember, clarity favors the calm.